Imagine a war so badly planned that Australia actually loses to emus. Generals approve nuclear bazookas, ice aircraft carriers, and bat-powered firestorms. These weren't jokes on a whiteboard. They were real, funded projects. Some nearly poisoned the planet. Others just blew up their own crews. You'll see tractors turned into tanks and submarines that sink themselves on impact. We've got suicide rocket planes, pigeon-guided missiles, and 1,000-ton fantasy megatanks. Every single idea passed meetings, signatures, and very serious uniforms. So how did any of this ever get a green light? Stay with me, because military genius is about to look very different. The Great Emu War. Australian soldiers losing to birds. Australian veterans came home from World War I and promptly lost to emus. In 1932, Western Australian farmers begged Canberra for help against crop-destroying flocks. The government sent Major G.P.W. Meredith with Lewis machine guns and army ammunition. On paper, it sounded simple. March out, find emus, mow them down. Instead, the birds scattered into small groups, sprinting faster than the trucks. Gunners bounced over rough fields, spraying bullets that mostly hit empty scrub. At one point, they fired thousands of rounds and counted only a few carcasses. Newspapers mocked the army for retreating, while emus still trampled wheat. Eventually, the operation was quietly scrapped, and farmers went back to fences. Bat bombs, America's plan to turn bats into fire bombs. A single weapons test accidentally burned part of a New Mexico airbase. That disaster came from Project X-Ray, the U.S. wartime bat bomb program. Dentist Lytle Adams proposed strapping tiny incendiary charges onto Mexican free-tailed bats. Researchers plan to drop hibernating bats over Japanese cities at dawn. Released from special canisters, the bats would scatter into attics and eaves. Timers on their napalm charges would then ignite hundreds of hidden rooftop fires. During trials at Carlsbad, armed bats escaped and torched mock buildings unexpectedly. The Navy briefly took over, but priorities shifted once the atomic bomb arrived. The bat bomb files were shelved, leaving behind charred test structures and rumors. Pigeon-guided missiles using trained birds to steer explosive warheads. In one U.S. lab, pigeons once flew a bomb better than electronics. Psychologist B.F. Skinner built a missile nose cone with 3 tiny pigeon cockpits. Each bird stared at a projected image of an enemy ship below. Whenever the ship drifted off-center, the pigeons pecked the screen to correct course. Their pecks moved internal sensors, which would steer the bomb's control surfaces. Skinner proved the pigeons could track a target through shaking and loud noise. They pecked thousands of times without panicking, calmly steering toward the ship's silhouette. Military brass loved the test films, then balked at trusting birds over circuits. Project Pigeon died as radar guidance improved, despite never actually failing trials. Project Habakkuk ice aircraft carrier built from frozen sawdust. British planners seriously discussed building a giant aircraft carrier out of ice. During World War II, Allied convoys desperately needed mid-Atlantic air cover against U-boats. Geoffrey Pike proposed Pikecrete, a mix of wood pulp and frozen water. Tests in Canada showed Pikecrete was tough, slow-melting, and bullet-resistant in cold. Engineers sketched a Berg-sized carrier for fighters, complete with refrigeration pipes. A small prototype was literally floated on a remote Canadian lake for months. But the full ship required enormous steel, coolant, and maintenance resources anyway. As regular escort carriers entered service, an ice mountain suddenly seemed less attractive. the Canadian test raft quietly melted away, taking Project Habakkuk with it. On some drawing boards, Nazi Germany literally tried to weaponize the sun. Engineers fantasized about a giant concave mirror orbiting Earth like an artificial moon. The sun gun would focus sunlight into a devastating beam over enemy cities. Concept sketches showed a space station crew steering the mirror toward targets. In practice, it required impossible materials, massive rockets, and decades of development. Even Nazi scientists admitted it was more science fiction than usable weapon. Still, propaganda loved hinting at future vengeance technology beyond Allied reach. Allied intelligence later found the files and filed them under Wild Dreams. The sun rose and set on schedule, never once melting London from orbit. Soviet anti-tank dogs that ran under the wrong tanks. On the Eastern Front, some Soviet units watched their own tanks explode. The blasts came from Soviet-trained anti-tank dogs, each carrying a belly-mounted charge. Handlers had taught hungry dogs to find food underneath rumbling armored vehicles. In training, those vehicles were Soviet diesel tanks, safe and stationary. In combat, noise, gunfire, and gasoline-smelling German armor confused the animals badly. Some dogs refused to approach. Others bolted back toward friendly trenches in panic. Reports circulated that several ran toward familiar Soviet engines instead of German ones. Red Army commanders eventually scaled back the program after heavy losses and chaos. The idea remained infamous. Loyal dogs turned into unreliable, tragic guided mines. Davy Crockett nuclear bazooka with crew inside blast radius. In the Cold War, American troops trained to fire nukes from tripods. The Davy Crockett system was a recoilless gun launching a tiny nuclear warhead. Infantry squads in Europe practiced deploying it from jeeps and simple ground mounts. On paper, it offered battlefield commanders a portable deterrent against Soviet armor. In reality, its effective range barely kept crews outside lethal radiation doses. Test shots showed blast, fallout, and accuracy problems all at once. Soldiers joked uneasily about wielding a weapon that could kill its team. As missile systems improved, the Davy Crockett quietly disappeared from the arsenal. Its photos now look like dark comedy, a nuke on a glorified tripod. Project Pluto, nuclear ramjet missile leaving radioactive fallout wherever it flew. American engineers once designed a cruise missile that poisoned everything beneath its path. Project Pluto aimed to build a nuclear-powered ramjet nicknamed the Flying Crowbar. A reactor inside the missile would superheat incoming air for near-endless thrust. It was supposed to skim low over the Soviet Union, dropping hydrogen bombs. Even without warheads, the unshielded reactor exhaust spewed intense radioactive particles. Test reactors in Nevada proved the physics, but terrified environmental and safety officials. Nobody could answer where such a missile would safely test fly in peacetime. Strategists finally preferred cleaner, simpler intercontinental ballistic missiles instead. Project Pluto's hardware was dismantled, leaving only photos and alarming design notes. Japan's fire balloons, hoping jet stream winds would burn America. One World War II weapon literally trusted the wind to do the aiming. Japan launched thousands of hydrogen balloons called Fugo toward North America. Each balloon carried incendiary and anti-personnel bombs hanging beneath paper envelopes. They rode the high-altitude jet stream discovered by Japanese meteorologists before the war. A small number reached the United States, Canada, and even Mexico. Most exploded harmlessly in forests or remote mountains, often without anyone noticing. Tragically, one balloon killed a pastor's wife and children in Oregon. American censors suppressed news to avoid helping Japan gauge the campaign's success. The program quietly ended, having started far more fires in Japanese forests. French Maginot Line that conveniently stopped at the Belgian border. France entered World War II behind what seemed an unbeatable wall of concrete. The Maginot Line bristled with underground bunkers, artillery casemates, and armored turrets. Engineers built it along the German frontier, assuming Belgium stayed friendly. When Germany invaded in 1940, panzer columns simply swept through Belgium instead. French commanders had mobile forces, but their deployment and timing lagged badly. German units used the Ardennes forest, considered tank-proof, as their main highway. While Maginot forts fought local skirmishes, German spearheads encircled French armies elsewhere. Some forts surrendered only after France itself was effectively defeated. The line became a symbol of brilliant engineering married to catastrophically narrow planning. Charge of the Light Brigade straight into Russian guns. British cavalry troopers rode straight down a valley lined with cannons. In 1854, during the Crimean War, miscommunicated orders reached Lord Cardigan. He led the Light Brigade toward Russian positions near Balaclava in broad daylight. Artillery on both sides of the valley poured fire into the advancing horsemen. Survivors later described shells ripping through saddle lines and emptying entire ranks. The brigade actually reached the Russian guns, sabering gunners in brutal close combat. With no support and mounting casualties, they had to retreat back through fire. Witnesses in the Allied command watched in horror from nearby hillsides. The episode endured as a textbook example of courage squandered by confused leadership. Gallipoli landings, sending troops onto cliffs overlooking narrow beaches. At Gallipoli, Allied troops stepped from boats into almost perfectly designed killing grounds. In 1915, British, Australian, and New Zealand forces tried to seize the Dardanelles. Many landed at coves backed by steep cliffs and ridges held by Turks. Ottoman defenders under Mustafa Kemal watched narrow beaches funnel attackers into tight clusters. Machine guns and rifles fired down from above as soldiers scrambled through surf. Units became tangled, landed at wrong spots, and struggled to climb loose slopes. Heat, disease, and supply problems turned the peninsula into a months-long stalemate. Repeated assaults failed to break through the ridges dominating the shoreline. Eventually, the Allies evacuated, leaving cemeteries and a bitter lesson in amphibious planning. Pickett's charge marching across open fields under Union artillery fire. On the third day at Gettysburg, Confederate infantry marched into a man-made storm. General Robert E. Lee ordered an assault against the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. George Pickett's division advanced across nearly a mile of open Pennsylvania farmland. Union artillery on the ridge and flanking hills had an unhindered view. Shells tore through gray ranks long before they reached Federal rifle lines. Survivors pushed through fences, regrouped, and briefly breached the stone wall defenses. For moments, hand-to-hand fighting surged around a spot later called the High Water Mark. Union reinforcements counterattacked, forcing the depleted Confederates to fall back again. Pickett's division returned shattered, and Lee's northern gamble effectively ended there. Operation Market Garden, betting everything on one congested highway. In 1944, Allied planners tried to end the war with one bold thrust. Operation Market Garden combined airborne drops with a narrow armored advance through Holland. Paratroopers from Britain, America, and Poland seized key bridges over Dutch rivers. Meanwhile, British 30th Corps had to race up a single elevated highway. German resistance regrouped faster than expected, especially around Arnhem's crucial bridge. British paratroopers under John Frost held part of the Arnhem span for days. Tanks and trucks below were delayed by ambushes, traffic jams, and blown culverts. By the time ground forces neared Arnhem, the airborne pocket was collapsing. The operation fell just short, leaving "a bridge too far" as its lasting nickname. Operation Sea Lion, planning to invade Britain without naval superiority. Germany seriously drafted invasion timetables while still losing the fight for the Channel. Operation Sea Lion called for barges and tugs to ferry troops from occupied France. Many of those craft were simple river barges, barely seaworthy in rough water. British Royal Navy destroyers and cruisers still heavily outmatched German surface forces. The plan assumed the Luftwaffe would crush the Royal Air Force first. Instead, the Battle of Britain ended with British fighters still contesting skies. Without air control, slow convoys crossing the Channel looked like perfect targets. German admirals quietly doubted the operation from the moment they saw the numbers. Sea Lion never launched, existing mostly as a chilling what-if on paper. Hitler declaring war on America after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler handed Franklin Roosevelt a huge advantage. Under the Tripartite Pact, Germany wasn't actually required to attack the United States. Yet in December 1941, Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war anyway. He assumed America would focus on Japan and struggle to rearm for Europe. Instead, U.S. factories rapidly shifted into full wartime production for multiple fronts. American troops and supplies began flowing into Britain, North Africa, and later France. German U-boats briefly exploited shipping, but Allied escort tactics improved quickly. By choosing open conflict, Hitler united American opinion against his regime. That impulsive declaration helped turn a regional European war into global catastrophe. Bay of Pigs invasion, sending lightly supported exiles against Castro. In 1961, Cuban exiles hit the beach, expecting an uprising that never came. The CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion landed at a remote southern Cuban bay. Planners imagined locals would rally, and maybe U.S. air power would quietly assist. Instead, Fidel Castro's forces reacted quickly, sealing roads and organizing defenses. Cuban aircraft strafed the invasion ships, sinking or damaging several supply vessels. The exiles' radios, ammunition, and fuel ran low as the beachhead shrank. Promises of American air cover were scaled back under political pressure in Washington. Within days, many anti-Castro fighters surrendered or tried escaping into the swamps. The fiasco strengthened Castro's position and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. Zimmerman telegram, asking Mexico to attack America for lost lands. One coded telegram helped push the United States into World War I. In 1917, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a secret message to Mexico. He proposed an alliance if America entered the war against Germany. In return, Mexico would supposedly reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona afterward. British intelligence intercepted and decrypted the message using captured German codebooks. They carefully revealed it to Washington without exposing exactly how it was obtained. When American newspapers printed the translated text, public outrage surged almost immediately. Zimmermann then publicly admitted the telegram's authenticity, removing any doubt about authorship. Soon after, Congress voted for war, and Germany gained another powerful enemy. Bob Semple, tank, turning a farm tractor into armored nonsense. New Zealand once tried to build a tank from corrugated iron and tractors. Fearing Japanese invasion, Minister of Works Bob Semple championed a homegrown design. Workers bolted improvised armor plating onto a Caterpillar tractor chassis. The result was tall, wobbly, and painfully slow over rough countryside. Its corrugated steel offered little real protection against modern anti-tank weapons. Inside, the crew squeezed among exposed gears, hot engine parts, and awkward gun mounts. Photographs show the vehicle towering over soldiers like a shed on tracks. Troops reportedly disliked its noise, instability, and terrible firing arcs. Only a few prototypes were built, then quietly scrapped once real tanks arrived. Tsar tank giant tricycle war machine that immediately bogged down. Russia's Tsar tank looked more like a carnival ride than a battlefield vehicle. Designed during World War I, it rolled on two enormous front wheels. Each wheel stood taller than many buildings, dwarfing the small rear roller. Engineers believed the high wheels could stride over trenches and barbed wire. During trials near Moscow, the back wheel sank into soft ground almost immediately. Despite powerful Maybach engines from captured Zeppelins, the front wheels spun uselessly. Attempts to tow or free the machine failed as it settled deeper into mud. Officials declared it too vulnerable and impractical compared to emerging tracked designs. The abandoned hulk rusted in a field for years before finally being scrapped. Confederate submarine Hunley sunk by the blast of its torpedo. The H.L. Hunley made history by sinking an enemy warship and itself. In 1864, the Confederate submarine attacked USS Housatonic outside Charleston Harbor. The Hunley carried a spar torpedo, an explosive charge mounted on a long pole. Crewmen cranked the hand-powered sub toward the Union sloop under cover of darkness. They rammed the spar into Housatonic's hull and detonated the explosive underwater. The Union ship sank quickly, marking the first successful submarine attack in combat history. But the blast's shockwave also likely crippled the nearby Hunley and its crew. The submarine disappeared, leaving only rumors until divers found it over a century later. Recovered remains suggested the confined crew probably died instantly from pressure shock. World War I human wave assaults against entrenched machine gun nests. On the Western Front, entire battalions walked into belts of overlapping gunfire. Early in World War I, generals still trusted massed infantry to break defenses. Artillery barrages would pound trenches, then whistles sent men over the top. They advanced shoulder to shoulder across muddy fields, burdened with packs and rifles. German and Allied machine gunners dug into concrete bunkers, waited behind barbed wire. When barrages lifted, defenders simply emerged and swept no man's land with fire. At battles like the Somme and Passchendaele, advances were measured in yards, not miles. Casualty lists climbed into the tens of thousands for minimal territorial gains. New tactics and technology eventually replaced those human waves, but painfully late. Cavalry charges ordered against Soviet tanks at Izbusensky in 1942. In 1942, Italian cavalrymen on the Eastern Front charged Soviet forces with sabers. The Savoia Cavalleria Regiment found Soviet infantry dug in near Izbusensky in Russia. Commanders ordered a mounted attack across open steppe under supporting machine gun fire. Horsemen galloped through trenches, throwing grenades and slashing with swords at defenders. Soviet units included anti-tank weapons and armored vehicles nearby on the broader front. While this particular charge achieved local success, it looked anachronistic beside T-34s. Photographs later showed Italian officers in plumed helmets against a backdrop of Soviet fields. The episode became one of the last notable cavalry charges in modern warfare. It also highlighted how slowly some doctrines adjusted to mechanized, combined arms realities. Bright parade uniforms still worn on smokeless powder battlefields. Before World War I, many soldiers marched into battle dressed like moving targets. French infantry famously wore blue coats and bright red trousers called pantalons rouges. Those colors made sense in earlier black powder battles filled with drifting smoke. Commanders once needed vivid uniforms to spot units through clouds and confusion. By the early 20th century, smokeless powder and machine guns changed everything. In 1914, French troops advanced in those parade colors against German field gray. German marksmen and machine gunners could easily pick them out across open fields. Heavy casualties in the war's first months finally forced France to adopt horizon blue. The color shift symbolized a long overdue realization. Visibility now meant vulnerability. Pearl Harbor, battleships moored together perfectly for Japanese torpedo bombers. On December 7, 1941, U.S. battleships sat lined up neatly along Ford Island. This battleship row mooring arrangement simplified maintenance and shore access for crews. It also presented a concentrated, unmoving target when Japanese aircraft approached Oahu. Torpedo bombers skimmed low over the harbor, releasing modified weapons for shallow water. Several ships, including USS Oklahoma and USS West Virginia, took multiple underwater hits. The close spacing meant oil fires and explosions quickly spread between neighboring hulls. Capsizing ships trapped sailors below decks, while damage control teams fought infernos. While aircraft carriers were absent, the battleship fleet suffered catastrophic losses. The layout became a case study in how convenience can amplify vulnerability. Operation Cottage, retaking an Aleutian island, the Japanese already abandoned. American and Canadian troops once fought a battle where the enemy had left. In 1943, Allied forces landed on Kiska Island in Alaska's Aleutian chain. They expected fierce Japanese resistance, similar to the brutal fighting on Attu. Instead, Japanese troops had secretly evacuated weeks earlier under foggy cover. Fog, mines, and nervous trigger fingers still made the landing extremely dangerous. Units got lost in rough volcanic terrain and sometimes stumbled into friendly positions. Skirmishes broke out between Allied patrols, each mistaking the other for Japanese. Mines and accidents added to the casualty list before commanders realized the truth. Operation Cottage became infamous as a costly, enemy-free island liberation. Operation Tiger D-Day rehearsal that killed hundreds of Americans. Before Normandy, a secret rehearsal in England turned into deadly chaos. Exercise. Tiger brought American troops to Slapton Sands in Devon for practice landings. The British coastline resembled Utah Beach, complete with live-fire training plans. During one-night convoy, German E-boats slipped in and attacked the troop ships. Torpedoes struck several landing craft, sending soldiers and vehicles into cold water. Many troops, overloaded with gear, drowned before rescue vessels could reach them. Communication errors meant some units remained unaware of the attack for critical minutes. Nearly as many Americans died in the rehearsal as on Utah Beach itself. The disaster was classified for months, even as surviving participants sailed for Normandy. Operation Barbarossa. Invading the Soviet Union without adequate winter gear. German troops advanced deep into the Soviet Union and then froze in place. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa launched massive armored columns toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. Early victories captured huge territories, but logistics already strained over muddy, rutted roads. By autumn, rains turned tracks into quagmires, and vehicles bogged down repeatedly. When winter hit, temperatures plunged far below what German planners had anticipated. Fuel thickened, lubricants froze, and tank engines struggled to start each morning. Many soldiers lacked proper coats, boots, or gloves for sustained sub-zero fighting. Soviet defenders, better prepared for the cold, counterattacked around Moscow and elsewhere. The stalled offensive marked a turning point. showing that weather can defeat empires. German Me-262 jet fighter forced into a pointless bomber role. The world's first operational jet fighter spent months chasing a job it hated. Germany's Me-262 could outrun Allied fighters and devastate bomber formations. Luftwaffe pilots begged to deploy it aggressively as a pure interceptor. Hitler insisted it be built as a fast bomber carrying small bomb loads. This meant redesigns, extra equipment, and doctrinal arguments during a critical period. Production delays and mixed mission priorities limited how many jets reached frontline units. When finally used as fighters, Me-262s downed Allied planes, but too few. Fuel shortages, rough airfields, and Allied air superiority further crippled their impact. A cutting-edge aircraft became another Wunderwaffe story of squandered potential and timing. Oka suicide rocket plane, requiring vulnerable bombers to carry it. Japan's Oka flying bomb looked terrifying on paper and disastrous in actual use. It was a manned rocket glider packed with explosives and short-range rocket motors. Slow Mitsubishi Betty bombers carried Okas under their wings toward American fleets. Enemy radar and fighters usually spotted the lumbering mother planes long before release. In one early mission, nearly all the Betty bombers were destroyed approaching Okinawa. Few Okas ever reached ideal launch positions, let alone their intended targets. Those that did could hit escort ships, but never a major capital ship. Pilots inside had almost no chance of survival once rockets ignited. The design showed how desperate late-war Japan had become, trading pilots for marginal results. Italy's invasion of Greece, ignoring mountains, weather, and Greek resistance. Mussolini promised Rome a quick victory in the Balkans and got a slog. In October 1940, Italian forces attacked Greece from bases in occupied Albania. Plans underestimated Greek morale, mountainous terrain, and brutal autumn weather entirely. Italian columns advanced along narrow valleys overlooked by well-placed Greek defenders. Snow, rain, and mud turned supply lines into treacherous, slow-moving trails. Greek counterattacks pushed Italian units back into Albania, capturing several border towns. Germany later intervened with its own Balkan campaign to rescue its embarrassed ally. The failed invasion tied down Axis troops and delayed operations elsewhere. It was remembered as the first serious Axis setback on land in Europe. Soviet penal battalions sent straight at German guns with rifles. On the Eastern Front, some Soviet soldiers fought under the threat of their own commanders. Penal battalions, or Strafunits, were filled with deserters, offenders, and political suspects. Commanders often sent them on the most dangerous assaults against entrenched German positions. These units sometimes had limited heavy weapons and minimal training for complex operations. Success in battle could theoretically redeem them, restoring some status or freedom. Failure often meant being shot by both German fire and Soviet blocking detachments. Stories from veterans describe desperate attacks across minefields and open ground. The Red Army eventually reduced the use of such units as the war turned. Their existence illustrates how human lives became another expendable resource in total war. Operation Unthinkable. Planning a surprise Allied attack on the Soviets. In 1945, British planners secretly wargamed a new war before the old one ended. Operation Unthinkable explored how Western allies might fight the Soviet Union in Europe. Winston Churchill ordered the study while Soviet armies still occupied much of Germany. One scenario envisioned a surprise attack aimed at pushing Soviet forces back east. Analysts quickly noted the Soviets outnumbered Allied ground divisions in Europe significantly. The plan even contemplated rearming German units to fight alongside British and American forces. projected casualty lists and political risks made the idea look nearly impossible. Staff reports concluded any offensive would likely become a long, grinding conflict. Operation Unthinkable stayed locked in archives, an example of how fear breeds extreme contingencies. Schwere Gustav railway gun requiring thousands of troops to fire. Germany built an artillery piece so big it needed its own railway network. Schwere Gustav, an 80-centimeter railway gun, weighed over 1,000 tons assembled. Krupp engineers designed it to smash French Maginot Line fortresses from afar. By the time it was ready, Germany had already bypassed those defenses. The gun still fired massive shells during the siege of Sevastopol in Crimea. Setting it up required laying special double tracks and building protective embankments. Hundreds of specialists and thousands of support troops surrounded the gun during operations. Allied aircraft could have targeted it, so dedicated anti-aircraft units guarded the area. After limited use, the gun was withdrawn and later destroyed to avoid capture. V3 supergun concept trying to shell London from France. Another Nazi project tried to hit London with shells instead of rockets. The V3 supergun used a long, hillside-mounted barrel with multiple side charges. Explosive boosters along the tube were meant to keep accelerating each projectile. Engineers began carving an underground complex at Mimoyec in northern France. From there, fixed barrels would permanently aim toward London across the Channel. Allied intelligence eventually discovered the site through reconnaissance and resistance reports. Heavy bombing, including deep-penetration earthquake bombs, wrecked tunnels and equipment. Two smaller V3 variants did fire at Luxembourg later, with limited effect. The main London gun dream ended buried under rubble before ever firing a shell. Germany's Wonder Weapons program, siphoning resources from boring practical guns. Nazi propaganda loved promising miracle weapons, long before they could possibly work. Under the label Wunderwaffe, Germany developed rockets, jets, and exotic late-war prototypes. Some, like the V2 and Me-262, were genuine technological milestones for aviation and rocketry. Others never left the drawing board or flew only in tiny experimental numbers. Each project consumed engineers, skilled workers, rare alloys, and valuable fuel supplies. Meanwhile, frontline units often lacked simple trucks, ammunition, or reliable conventional tanks. The obsession with revolutionary designs pulled attention from incremental, mass-produced improvements. Even successful wonder weapons arrived too late and in too few quantities. In the end, no futuristic gadget could compensate for strategic overreach and material shortages. U.S. Navy blimp patrols that still managed to collide and crash. American blimps once patrolled coastlines for submarines and ended up as strange crash stories. During World War II, K-class and L-class airships hunted U-boats off American shores. They carried depth charges, radar, and small crews scanning ocean surfaces for periscopes. Blimps had long endurance and great visibility, but they hated sudden storms and fog. Some were lost in bad weather accidents, slamming into hillsides or power lines unexpectedly. One famous case saw blimp L-8 drift ashore in California without its crew. Residents watched the sagging airship hit houses while investigators found the gondola empty. Rumors of sabotage and sea monsters followed, but official reports remained inconclusive. The incidents showed that even safe patrol craft could turn bizarre under wartime pressure. Operation Crossroads, parking surplus warships next to nuclear test blasts. In 1946, a ghost fleet gathered at Bikini Atoll to be sacrificed. Operation Crossroads assembled nearly 100 obsolete or captured ships in a tight cluster. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, submarines, and transports waited in the lagoon as targets. American planners wanted to see how atomic bombs would treat traditional naval power. The first test exploded a plutonium device in the air above the fleet. The second detonated an identical weapon underwater, throwing up a radioactive base surge. Some ships sank outright. Others remained afloat, but dangerously contaminated with fallout. Decontamination crews struggled to scrub hulls clean, often with limited protective equipment. The tests proved that nuclear blasts could cripple fleets without even sinking every ship.